am happy to introduce our speaker today, Tom Rosenstiel. He's a journalist, author, and one of the nation's most distinguished thinkers on the future of media, which we absolutely need at this moment in time, I would suggest. And he's also the executive director of the American Press Institute and a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institute. Before joining the American Press Institute in January of 2013, he founded and was the director of the Project for Excellence in Journalism at the Pew Research Center in Washington, D.C. He co-founded and served as vice chair of the Committee of Concerned Journalists. He's an author of 9 books, just in case you're feeling like you're not up to his standards. I would agree with you, you aren't. His first novel, Shining City, in 2017, about a Supreme Court nomination, was on NPR's Book of the Year. His second book, The Good Lie, in 2019, was about a terrorist incident, was a Washington Post bestseller. And his third novel, Oppo, was published this past Tuesday, and there's a book signing afterwards in the atrium, should you want to check that out. Tom has written 7 books on journalism, politics, and ethics. Among them is The Elements of Journalism, What News People Should Know and the Public Should Expect, and that was co-authored by Bill Kovach. It's been translated into more than 25 languages and is used widely in journalism education courses worldwide, including a course here by Professor Jan Cooper's Journalism Basics, which is one of the courses that we have here and many students take advantage of. The Elements of Journalism has been called a modern classic by the New York Times and is one of the 5 best books ever written on journalism, according to the Wall Street Journal. During his journalism career, he worked as a media writer for the Los Angeles Times for a decade, chief congressional correspondent for Newsweek, press critic for MSNBC, business editor of the Peninsula Times Tribune, and a reporter for Jack Anderson's Washington Merry-Go-Round column, and he began his career at the Woodside Country Almanac in his native Northern California. He's won too many awards to announce at this moment, but it's been the Goldsmith Book Award for Harvard is one, 4 Sigma Delta Chi Awards for journalism research. But the most important thing about our speaker today is that he's a graduate from Oberlin. He graduated in 1978 with a BA in English. During his time here, he was a varsity soccer player and editor of the Oberlin Review. He went on to earn his master's degree in journalism from Columbia University. And the title of Tom's talk today could not be more timely: Objectivity, Facts, Fiction, and the Future of Journalism. Welcome Tom Rosenstiel back to Oberlin.
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you for being here. And thank you, Carmen. It is always a great pleasure to come back to Oberlin, a place that is make a huge impression on me, as I think it does everyone who goes here. I'm going to go quickly through slides rather than just give an oral talk. I was told that works better. Here we go. So this has been called the post-fact age. What does that mean, and is it really true? And if so, what are the implications of moving past facts for media, for science, for learning, for everything, really? How do we function as a democracy? To answer that, I think it's useful to figure out first, or touch first on what got us here. One key to this notion that people are distrustful of facts is how trust in media has plummeted. Trust in many institutions has plummeted, but media even more so. By half from what it was when I graduated Oberlin in '78. In 1977, 72% of US adults had at least a fair amount or higher trust in mass media. Today, that number has fallen to 32%. Or by 16, it had fallen to 32%. Now, it's interesting to note, half of that decline in trust happened before the internet, from 1980, really, to 1997. Other interesting to note, Trump has increased trust in media by 9 points since 2016, and not just among Democrats. So what happened between 1977 and 1997? What was going on? Well, there are 3 things that I think are particularly important. One is that technology created many more outlets, particularly cable, it's for the students who are here, the idea that the television dial went from 4 channels to 400 was as enormous in its own way as the creation of the internet. And the government decided, as that was occurring, that they could remove regulations on electronic media. We had rules that essentially would have made Fox against the law. Same with MSNBC. And those rules were put in place, interestingly, as the United States came out of World War II and saw what fascist governments had done, particularly in Germany, to try and control information. They said, we have to set up systems here as we develop television, which people were really scared of. There are only going to be 3 or 4 big channels, and what could their sway be over the public? Let's put these rules in that make sure that they are bipartisan, that they are non-partisan, that they're not very political. The equal time rule and the fairness doctrine basically said, you're a carrier, you're a platform, you need to carry all points of view. The third thing that happened during this period was you then had new media coming up, particularly talk radio, which became highly partisan and marketed itself as the antidote to the dominant liberal mainstream media, the lamestream media. So what was a latent concern about media on the right became a much more explicit one. Technology and choice correlate here. Whether they're causal, I don't know. I'm not a social scientist, but they correlate to decline in trust. The other thing that happened was that media distrust became a partisan issue. If you can see that, it's that 21% of Republicans have a fair amount of trust in media. By the way, interestingly, up from 14% when Trump got elected, versus 76% of Democrats. And independents, who now make up a third of the electorate, are right in between. One ominous note is that the group that is the most distrustful of media after Republicans are people under 40, under 30. Why is that? My guess is that because people who are under 30 and really under 40 grew up in this multifaceted media ecosystem with many more partisan outlets than people my age did. So their notion, whether that's Sean Hannity or somebody on MSNBC, their notion that the media is Walter Cronkite-like and playing it down the middle doesn't fit with reality. And even the outlets that say they are doing that, they're highly suspicious of that. And all this, by the way, before 2016. And this guy comes in. Trump's language. Any news that's critical of him is fake news. The news media are the enemy of the people, and the news media are failing. What's behind that? What if we decoded Trump's rhetoric? Fake means they're unreliable. Don't believe them. What they say isn't true. The enemy, they're elitist. They are against me, and so they're against you. And they're failing. They're on the wrong side of history, whereas I'm on the right side of history. The goal of this rhetoric is important to understand. The goal of it is not to make people believe fake news, to believe Breitbart or other websites that are actual fake news. It's to make people doubt all news so that they have to rely on Trump as their truth teller. And it's a very classic technique. I'm part of a group called the International Fact Checkers, and we have these conferences around the world, and people from Turkey and Brazil say, oh, you're in the first reel of your movie. We've seen this for 18 years. We can tell you what Trump will be doing next. So this kind of rhetoric is typical and not unique to Trump. But it poses an existential challenge to journalism and to the notion of shared facts, a public square. How do journalists cover someone in a disinterested way who calls them the enemy? How should they report facts about someone who believes that facts are subordinate to beliefs? I mean, one of the interesting things that you see with Trump is when he has been fact-checked to be wrong, by the Washington Post or PolitiFact or one of these other organizations that does this verification process. He doubles and triples and quadruples down on the thing that he said that has been fact-checked to be wrong. He understands that repetition is very powerful. He understands, or his people around him understand the neuroscience, that if you repeat something, you can even make people believe things they know are not true. There's a study, one of my favorite studies, that shows that they expose people to the idea that Scottish men wear saris. And they found that if they repeated this enough, people would say, I thought it was kilts, but I guess I was wrong. How, as a public, can we rise above our prejudices and fears? As consumers, as educated Oberlin graduates, how do we consume media with an open mind and not gravitate? How many here watch MSNBC? Boo, bad for you. Just kidding. And where does that leave objectivity and the notion of objective facts? Well, and this is particularly aimed at the students who are in the room. To start, I will tell you that most people badly understand what the notion of objectivity means, especially in journalism. Objectivity was never meant to mean neutrality, or the person who was producing something that was supposedly objective had no opinions, was a cipher. It's what some have called, some scholars, and including Jay Rosen at NYU, is called the view from nowhere. I'll just say the view from nowhere is BS. Objectivity came to journalism in the 1920s, at the dawn of modernism, with a growing awareness of subjectivity and bias and the unconscious, and a growing awareness of the failures of traditional journalistic practices. One of the major proponents of it was Walter Lippmann, who had just done a study of the failure of the New York Times in its coverage of the Russian Revolution. Why had the Times misunderstood what was going to happen in the revolution? So this was not a group of people who were naive. They were trying to bring a concept from the academy into journalism. And Lippmann called for journalists to aspire to the exercise of the highest scientific virtues, to develop a common intellectual method and a common area of valid fact by developing method, a discipline of verification, and a series of methodologies as we use in social science. In short, objectivity was meant to refer to the method by which information was acquired, not the idea that the researcher, the journalist, him or herself, was objective. Their method had to be objective precisely because they never could be themselves. So method, professional method, was a way to overcome or compensate or work with your personal beliefs and biases. The journalists never had a view from nowhere. They stood on some very fundamental core beliefs in empiricism, freedom of expression, government transparency, fairness. I don't have to read the whole slide. There are news organizations that will even tell you, we stand for there's a group in San Diego called Voice of San Diego. We stand for the following things: a safe city, transparent government. It's a long list. And they say, we're not going to advocate for solutions about these things, but you should know these are things that we stand for. Our view is not from nowhere. It's for certain things. And certainly facts and empiricism are part of journalism. As Bill and I say in The Elements of Journalism, personal background and belief informs this work. Gender, geography, ethnicity, history, belief. If you're a WASP, a Jew, Asian, Black, Hispanic, whatever those things are, you don't deny their influence on you. You incorporate them, and you're aware of them. In fact, the biases that really hurt anyone trying to do something objective are the biases you're in denial of or unaware of. But if you also allow these personal beliefs to overwhelm your professionalism, that's a failure. Like a doctor who poorly treats people she doesn't like, or an attorney who decides to not give the best defense to somebody because just doesn't like them, or a police officer who is going hysterical about something. If we replace the word objectivity with the word transparency, we get closer to what Lippmann had in mind. Just as in science, if I can see how the work was done, I can discern whether I can trust it, I can try and replicate it. Okay, so we now have a different, I hope, definition of objectivity. Where does that leave journalism and facts today? Well, journalism grew out of the democratic Enlightenment. It grew out of the idea that people could govern themselves. And it was a vehicle that took information that was once held by the few and made it available to the many. One of the first newspapers in England had to sue to get the Parliament, to let the government allow them to write what had been said in Parliament. It was an act of transparency because people could not govern if they had no information. The word public did not begin to appear in the English language, at least, until after the printing press, as information began to flow more freely. And the primary purpose of journalism, as it began to evolve, the first newspapers coming up about 1600, was to provide people with information that they needed to be self-governing. Journalism and democracy are tied together. Journalism is an instrument of democracy. And there are a few core principles that underlie that. This is work that I've done for many, many years. The first one is that journalism's first obligation is to the truth. What do we mean by truth? We don't mean truth like you might talk about in a philosophy class at Oberlin. We mean truth that we would call functional or practical truth, the way that juries, governments, police decide things and are able to move forward. This notion of truth can evolve over time. It's a living thing. But it is not some abstract notion. It's something that we can act on. And it goes beyond mere accuracy. It goes to getting context right. In 1947, there was an important commission done called the Hutchins Commission that was trying to figure out after World War II, what are the responsibilities of the press, particularly as electronic media was about to change our culture. And one of the things that they said in the Hutchins Commission is it's not enough to get the facts right. You have to get the truth about the facts right. You have to get the context right. So these notions are not new. That was a long time ago. But that context is something that emerges over time through multiple accounts. It may not be there in the first story. If there's a car crash at North and Main, we know there was a car crash at North and Main on the first day. It may take weeks before we discover that the road was built shoddily, that the lights don't work, that the grading on the road is bad, or all the other things that may have led to that accident. A few more of the principles that exist in journalism. The journalists, and we've done a lot of research on this, journalists' first loyalty is to citizens, more even than to their company. They think of it as a mission. They move from place to place. They have the same standards. They have to be independent from faction. We talked to Bill Sapphire at some length about what made him, when he made the journey from being speechwriter for Nixon to opinion columnist for the New York Times. And he said, basically, I think for myself. I'm not doing this for the team, any team. I'm my team. Very important and a problem, I think, with our media ecosystem today, particularly some of the cable channels. And to provide a forum for criticism and compromise, Citizens have an obligation in this, and as we say in the Elements of Journalism, to become, particularly as they become their own editors, to be open-minded, to embrace new facts, to try and learn about things and people they don't understand. Hard, and the platform companies make it harder because they filter you and filter you and filter you. And if you want to see things that you disagree with in a social media platform, you have to aggressively like people that you don't like so that you can continue to see opinions that you disagree with. So the question, I think, that we have to ask to answer the question at the top was, do these principles still apply? Do people still want the truth? Does it still matter? I think that we do. I think people do want what they call the truth. Research shows no one wants to be deceived. They're angry when they're deceived. The guy who brought an automatic assault weapon to the pizza parlor 5 blocks from my house in Washington, D.C., and fired it because he thought there was a child pedophile ring in the basement, which I and my family were implicated in the pedophile ring, said, I wanted to see for myself if it was true. So I believe that the principles of what audiences want from the news hasn't changed, but the way that journalists fulfill those, do the job, fulfill those principles, live up to telling the truth, has to change drastically. And here are some modest proposals for how, which I hope are timely, because as Oberlin thinks about a concentration in this. First, the dominant metaphor in the 20th century about journalism was that journalism was a gatekeeper over what the public knew. That metaphor no longer applies. Journalists are no longer gatekeepers. They are often today, more often, not always, annotators of what the public has already heard. The president has already tweeted something. Now the press is trying to figure out, is what he said true or not? How do you annotate facts in a world of distrust and disbelief? The second step, I think, in this is that we have to rediscover this lost meaning of objectivity, to understand that the key to journalism is a discipline of evidence, inference, and verification. How do you get things right? How do you know if things are true? Just going and being a stenographer, sticking a microphone in front of someone is not journalism. That's just technology. The process, the method, the professional discipline of knowing how do we check it out is what will distinguish good journalism from bad. That's the lost meaning of objectivity. And to this discipline, I would add some new ideas. And here's my suggestion for Oberlin on this. There are lessons that journalists do not know from anthropology, from ethnography, from historiography, from law, from all kinds of realms beyond traditional journalism practice that can make journalism better in a world of suspicion and disbelief. And then to that, my third idea, add a new science of presentation. What do I mean by that? It would include growing methods in journalism and elsewhere about transparency. How do you explain sources, story selection method? I don't know how many of you read the New York Times or the Washington Post, but you'll notice when they have a story, they'll say, this story is based on interviews with 27 people in the West Wing who spoke to us anonymously, et cetera, et cetera. All of those steps, but there is a growing body of research about how to do more than that. How to show people the work and even anticipate the questions they have ahead of time and billboard those to say, what's new here? Why do we know this? What are we unsure of? The more you can exercise that kind of transparency, the better your chance of people believing you. And there's research to back that up. This new science of presentation that I would suggest also builds stories differently. Visual storytelling is proven to be much more persuasive to skeptical audiences. Interactives have long lives. There's a whole body of science and work now around how to present information in non-narrative ways that people are more receptive to. And that also makes the news more accessible. I don't know about you, Lippmann even talked about this, but certainly when I was young, when I was at Oberlin, I thought the news is like a cocktail party where you show up late and you don't really know anybody. People are having all these conversations about stuff that you don't really sort of kind of maybe understand it, but not really. Some story about Medicare or the public option. What is that exactly? And traditional storytelling particularly, you have to start at the top and read all the way through, and you're lost pretty quickly. These new story techniques can turn that forbidding cocktail party into something much more welcoming. and that's an important technique. And also, I would say, draw lessons, a growing body of lessons from neuroscience about what does make people willing to listen. One of the concepts that I find really interesting lately is something called metaperceptions. Metaperception is what it is that I think people who disagree with me think about me. When Hillary Clinton said half of Donald Trump's supporters are a basket of deplorables, she was nailing a perfect metaperception. People who liked Trump thought, that's exactly what I thought she thought of me, and all the people like her. Very damaging. Metaperceptions are a big part of what drives polarization. My fourth modest proposal is recognize now that journalism is collaborative intelligence. It's not a lecture, a reporter going out with a notebook, coming back with a story, and writing it down. It's a melding of the public, technology, and professional journalism. The public has expertise. They're doctors and lawyers and all these smart people out there. They have multiple perspectives. They can be in many places all at once. David Farenholt writes about for the Washington Post about Donald Trump's charities. He goes on Twitter and says, I'm working on the following story today. Anybody got some stuff that can help me with that? He located Trump's portrait that his charity had paid for. He located it at a Donald Trump golf club in Florida by asking people on Twitter if anybody had ever seen this picture and knew where it might be. And by midnight, somebody who was following, I mean, many people responded, said, I think it's here, I think it's there, I think it's... And one of his followers actually checked into the club that night and got a janitor to take him to the room where the portrait was. He did his reporting entirely out in the open. Machines, which we can use, can count, they can predict, they can make our knowledge more empirical, our journalism more empirical. And then journalists have these other skills. They can triangulate, they can listen to all of these things. They have access to people in power so that they can interrogate them. They can, and then presumably they have some skills in presentation. They will also need, however, to keep an open mind, what I call the cold eye, to not take sides. Journalism also has to label better. We have gotten into a situation now where you cannot tell what's opinion versus news, and that's really destructive. And that happens every day on television, where you've got a lineup of people, some of them are journalists, some of them are advocates, some of them are former public officials, you don't know who's who. This is corrosive. This adds to polarization and distrust. And finally, my little bit of old school, I think journalists need to remain calm and professional. Hysteria and partisanship plays into Trump's game of saying that the press are the enemy of the people. The more dispassionate the press can be, the more chance it has to create a common public square. No one wants their doctor to be in distress. When you go into surgery, you don't want the doctor to be thinking, oh man, this looks really bad. Any more than you want a police officer who stops you to be animated. We require this of the people who are what I would call our committed observers, our surrogate observers on our behalf. Marty Barron, who's the editor of the Washington Post, says we're at work, not at war. What's that mean? What's the difference? War takes sides. It lacks humility. It uses emotion rather than evidence. It's given ad hominem attack. Very bad people, that's a term we've become familiar with. Work is designed to inform rather than persuade. It anticipates the doubts of a skeptical audience. It does not go past what it can prove. What is the difference between activism and journalism? In many ways, it boils down to this. Activists are trying to get their audience to a certain outcome, to act in a certain way. Journalists are trying to present information to a public for the public to consider, not to act. It's how they act is up to them. But to present new information for people to think about and have conversation about. One of the great journalism scholars, Jim Carrey, said, in the end, journalism is conversation among citizens. An alternative editor who said she thought that objectivity was BS told me many years ago, it's okay for my reporters to have a point of view, but not until they understand all the other points of view. And I said, that's objectivity. So lately, as was mentioned by Carmen, I've moved to fiction. Because, you know, I gave the talk and I thought, nah, I don't agree. I give up. Fiction tells a different kind of truth. And you know, when I started writing novels, I didn't think, oh, I need to tell a different kind of truth. I thought, oh, I like reading these things. Maybe I could write one. And I was bored at work and a little unhappy, and that's why I thought I was doing it. But it turns out that there was something else going on. What fiction gets at is not functional truth, but something more interior. The truth beyond the observable world, Hemingway called it. It's what's in people's hearts, not just the words, but how did something feel? Why do people do this? What are they longing for? And how were people changed afterwards? These are hard things for journalism to get at. They're not impossible. You'll find them in books. We may even find them at the end of the impeachment process. But I think we know where that's going to end. But they're rare in journalism, and rarer today than they used to be because the news moves so fast. Journalism is on its firmest ground when it's reporting the observable. What was said? Who was in the room? How many people died in that crash? The physical externalities of the world are journalists' stock and trade. But if the news only tells us what we already know or only reassures us or leaves us feeling that what's happening is inexplicable, then our journalism is failing us. It's there to make the world explicable, at least the observable world. And so here's my close. The next journalism must rediscover the lost objectivity of method, add new disciplines of verification, transparency, and presentation, and regain its dispassion so that it can speak to more people. This has happened before during other moments of crisis and need. Remember that chart from earlier that I showed you about trust and how it's upticked since Donald Trump took power? Donald Trump has made the press better, despite himself. We're not in the post-fact age. we're actually on the brink of the better fact age. And it will be people like the ones who are here at Oberlin, who are students today, who will invent that better fact age, I think. Thank you.